Have you ever wondered if something can really last forever? What if, instead of being destroyed by external forces, capitalism is quietly digging its own grave? Karl Marx believed so. For him, capitalism, as it grew and expanded, would inevitably come into conflict with itself. Its internal contradictions, such as growing inequality, the exploitation of the workforce, and the commodification of all aspects of life, would act as cracks in a building that seems solid, but is slowly giving way under its own weight. On the other side of philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche perhaps saw capitalism not as a flaw, but as an expression of human nature. The will to power transformed into capital accumulation, technological expansion, and control of time and matter. In this sense, the system would not be a mistake, but the modern face of the human desire to dominate the world around them. But what if this impulse is becoming uncontrollable? What happens when a system grows to such an extent that not even its creators can stop it? Today, we don't just live under an economic model. We live within a logic that shapes the way we see the world. Capitalism is no longer just a cog that drives production and consumption. It has become the very fabric of reality. As philosopher Mark Fisher wrote, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." This feeling that there is no alternative is what Fisher called capitalist realism. It's a kind of ideological fog that prevents the imagination from conceiving of anything outside the logic of the market. Even the harshest criticism of the system ends up being absorbed by it and turned into a product. Rebellion becomes a brand. Defiance becomes style. The system is so all-encompassing that it can even feed off the opposition. But what if it's heading for a point of no return? The theory of accelerationism proposes a bold hypothesis. Capitalism is self-destructing through its own speed. By incorporating all forms of innovation and intensifying the logic of efficiency, it may be destabilizing the very pillars that sustain it. Technology, which has always worked as its ally, may be becoming its enemy. Automation eliminates jobs faster than new functions are created. Artificial intelligence is beginning to make decisions previously reserved for specialists. And with that, consumption itself, the basis of capitalist growth, is at risk, because an unemployed mass doesn't consume. It's a paradox. By seeking maximum productivity, the system threatens its own source of profit. History shows that no system is eternal. Feudalism dominated Europe for centuries and seemed unshakable. However, demographic changes, urbanization, and new technologies were enough to bring it crashing down. The Roman Empire lasted more than 1,000 years. It seemed indestructible, but it collapsed not just because of external pressures, but because of its own inability to sustain its expansion model. What if capitalism is going through the same process? The difference is that this time the machine is running much faster. Globalization connects everything in real time. Markets collapse in minutes. Information spreads in seconds. Complexity has reached a point where a simple failure can trigger a planetary chain reaction. Jean Baudrillard went even further. He said that capitalism not only organizes reality, but replaces it with simulations. We live in a world where images, data, algorithms, and brands are more real than concrete experiences. We don't just consume products. We consume meaning, status, and identity. Every choice, every click, every desire is tracked and monetized. Even our emotions are exploited as raw material for an economy of affection. And in this scenario, the subject itself becomes merchandise. Identity becomes branding. Opinion becomes content. Criticism becomes engagement. Everything is absorbed and recycled in favor of the system. Capitalism has survived wars, recessions, and revolutions. Its ability to adapt is impressive, but that doesn't mean it's indestructible. Resilience can only be a delay in the inevitable. What seemed immortal may just be resisting its own obsolescence. What if, as in the myth of Icarus, capitalism has flown too high, driven by ambition and blind trust in progress? Perhaps the question is no longer whether it will end. Perhaps what remains to be seen is when, and what comes next. But eventually, all acceleration meets resistance. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question. Who is really in control? Is someone still holding the steering wheel, Or are we all being driven by a machine that no longer responds to human commands? The feeling that capitalism is uncontrollable is not new, but it has intensified in recent decades as technology has become the main engine of social transformation. Large technology corporations, such as Amazon, Google, Meta, Apple, have surpassed the value of many nation-states. Their algorithms determine what we see, buy, and think. The digital economy no longer depends on scarcity, but on attention. And human attention, unlike data, is limited. The result is a system that competes for our focus, draining our cognitive energy while collecting and monetizing every click. The financialization of everyday life has turned reality into an abstraction. What was once a physical product is now a token, data, an automated contract. Artificial intelligence not only interprets the world, but is beginning to decide for us. In GPS routes, video recommendations, job hiring, and more recently, in the production of content, art, and language. Nick Land, one of the most radical names in accelerationism, saw capitalism as an autonomous organism that evolves on its own, driven by technology and the desire to overcome all human limits. Land believed that acceleration is inevitable, that the system is moving with such speed that it has already outstripped the ability of governments, laws, and even corporations to regulate it. For him, the future doesn't belong to humanity, but to digitized capital, intelligent machines, and self-regulating algorithms. Artificial intelligence doesn't need a passport, he wrote, highlighting capital's ability to escape any national, physical, or ethical borders. What is being designed in this scenario is a world where decisions no longer go through democratic processes, but through the invisible protocols of technological platforms. And this profoundly transforms the role of politics. Governments try to regulate the effects of digital capitalism, but are often 10 steps behind. Legal structures still think in industrial terms, while capital already operates at high frequency, responding to events in microseconds, with financial flows that cross the globe before an authority can even intervene. There is no time for deliberation when the logic is that of the algorithm. This speed has real consequences. The platform economy, by eliminating intermediaries, has also eliminated social protection links. Informal digital work, promoted as flexibility, is often synonymous with precariousness. Drivers, delivery people, freelancers, all bound by a logic of constant productivity, monitored by metrics and rewarded by scores. A study by the International Labor Organization revealed that the majority of platform workers are paid less than the minimum wage per hour actually worked. Meanwhile, the owners of digital infrastructures accumulate record profits. The asymmetry is so great that the system is beginning to resemble a digital feudalism. A few owners of land, now servers and software, and millions of vassals connected out of necessity. The most alarming thing is that, even in the face of this imbalance, the system continues to function. Crises that once seemed like moments of disruption are now incorporated as part of the normal flow. The COVID-19 pandemic has further accelerated the digitalization of the economy. Remote working, online education, consumption via apps, all became standard in a matter of months. While billions suffered from the health and economic crisis, tech giants saw their fortunes double. And this reveals a new logic. Capitalism doesn't just resist crises, it learns to profit from them. With each disruptive event, the system reorganizes itself more quickly, shifting costs to the bottom and concentrating gains at the top. The idea that capitalism is resilient may need to be revised. What looks like resilience may actually be a process of progressive dehumanization. A system that survives at the cost of discarding millions of people, making life more precarious, exploiting even the most intimate data, is not strong. It is insensitive. And if this logic continues, the risk is not just of economic collapse, but of a civilizational mutation. A world where technology, once seen as liberating, becomes a mechanism of control, exclusion, and inequality. And in this world, the question that echoes is disturbing. If capitalism continues to accelerate, what will be left of humanity at the end of this race? Perhaps no one will be in charge anymore. And this idea, however uncomfortable, doesn't seem so far from reality. Capitalism, as a form of emergent intelligence, may have become a self-replicating system that grows on its own, adapting without the need for a human control center. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari already pointed to this fluid nature of capitalism, describing it as a deterritorializing flow, an organism that moves, spreads, and corrupts fixed structures as it expands. Capital doesn't need a homeland, morals, or meaning. It just needs movement. And if capitalism is no longer a tool under human control, but a structure that operates by inertia, perhaps the only way to confront it is to allow its logic to reveal itself to the end. Acceleration, in this sense, would not be a revolutionary strategy, but an inevitable consequence of the system's own internal logic. After all, if everything needs to grow constantly, what happens when the physical, social, and psychological limits are reached? Technology, which seemed to be the promise of human emancipation, is beginning to show itself as a trap in disguise. By automating functions, optimizing decisions, and speeding up processes, it reorganizes life around an algorithmic logic. Productivity becomes the criterion of existential value. And in this environment, the human person loses ground. Nicholas Carr, in his book The Shallows, warned about how the internet is shaping our brains to think in a superficial, fragmented, and reactive way. This is not just a question of distraction, but of cognitive transformation. The subject himself is being shaped by the digital environment in which he lives, and this has profound implications for our ability to imagine alternatives, reflect critically, and resist the dominant logic. Accelerationist thinking, at this point, is divided into two main currents. On the one hand, there are those who believe that acceleration could lead us to a post-capitalist world, where technology would free human beings from compulsory labor, scarcity, and competition. This view is influenced by an optimistic reading of Marx, who saw in the productive forces a potential for overcoming the very system that engendered them. If technology reaches a level of efficiency where production becomes almost automatic, perhaps we can imagine a cooperatively organized society, focused on collective well-being rather than profit, an economy based on abundance rather than scarcity. But this idea comes up against a simple question: who will control the automated means of production? Machines don't liberate on their own. They only replace, and it all depends on who programs, controls, and benefits from this process. On the other side of the debate is a much darker view, led by thinkers like Nick Land, who argue that the fate of acceleration is not liberation, but the obsolescence of humanity. For Land, technology is not being appropriated by humans. It is replacing us. Artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and automated capital can continue to operate even without us. A future in which capitalism survives, but human beings become irrelevant. Back in the 20th century, the philosopher Gunther Anders warned of the obsolescence of the human being, pointing out that our ability to create technologies outstripped our ability to understand and control them. This disparity between creation and understanding is what makes the process so dangerous. It's not just about faster machines, but systems that escape human consciousness, that make decisions based on data we can't interpret, and that operate with a logic that is indifferent to life, ethics, and the future. If before we feared that machines would dominate us, today the most plausible fear is that we will simply be discarded as an inefficient variable. The logic of capital does not demand empathy, it seeks results. And technological acceleration, by favoring the automation of everything that can be codified, is slowly excluding subjectivity, human time, error, care, everything that cannot be transformed into a metric. Ultimately, this trend leads to a crisis that is not just economic or social, but existential. What does it mean to be human in a world where everything that is properly human, such as fragility, doubt, slowness, becomes an obstacle to the efficiency of the system? Bifo Berardi, a contemporary Italian philosopher, suggests that we are trapped in a psychic impasse. We know that capitalism is unsustainable, that its acceleration is pointing towards collapse, but our imagination has been hijacked. We can't visualize any other form of existence. We live like addicts, aware of the poison but unable to stop. And this is perhaps the most dangerous point of all. Not the collapse itself, but the paralysis in the face of it. The inability to conceive of what comes next. And if we don't find this new path of our own volition, history may force us to, in a way that we may not be prepared to face. In the end, all of this forces us to ask a deeper question. What do we really want as a species? The acceleration of capitalism may be driving us to breaking point, but before we can think about how to curb this process, perhaps we need to understand what it is that drives us. Do we want a world where technology frees us from work or just replaces us? Do we want capitalism to change into something fairer? Or do we secretly want it to continue, as long as it's comfortable for a few? Slavoj Žižek, a contemporary Slovenian philosopher, proposes that the problem is not just with the system, but with the very human desire that feeds it. According to Žižek, as long as we don't rethink what we desire, we will continue to be trapped in the logics we criticize today. Capitalism doesn't just maintain itself through the power of corporations or media manipulation. It sustains itself because it responds, albeit perversely, to our deepest desires for security, control, and recognition. That's why, even knowing its flaws, we continue to take part in the game. We buy, we post, we compete. Even though part of us knows that this model is exhausted. It's as if we were in the grip of a collective addiction. And as with any addiction, the first barrier to overcome is not the substance itself, but the illusion that there is no life possible outside of it. The problem is not just structural, but psychic, affective, and symbolic. Throughout history, systems considered unbreakable have been replaced. Feudalism seemed eternal, but collapsed when new forms of production and thought emerged. The Roman Empire seemed invincible, but collapsed when its structure became too heavy to sustain its own logic of expansion. Capitalism, despite its chameleon-like ability to adapt, is not exempt from this process. Walter Benjamin warned that progress, celebrated as a sign of human advancement, could actually be an angel of destruction, an accelerated march towards the abyss. But there is a crucial difference. This time, the system is not just a political or economic model, but an existential framework. It defines our values, organizes our time, structures our relationships, and even the criteria by which we measure ourselves. In this sense, its fall would not just be the replacement of one form by another, but the need to rebuild the very foundations of life and society. This transition will not happen automatically. Acceleration alone may push us towards collapse, but it won't tell us what to build next. Without a clear vision of what we want in place, the void left by the collapse could be filled by even more destructive forms of social organization. Digital authoritarianism, technocratic totalitarianism, or even an anarchic fragmentation of the world into microspaces of control and surveillance. History is full of moments when the old world died, but the new one could not yet be born. Antonio Gramsci called this interval of crisis an interregnum, a strange, confusing time when the old structures no longer work, but the new ones don't exist yet. It's possible that we're at exactly that moment right now. The old promises of progress, meritocracy, and social mobility seem exhausted, but the alternatives are still in gestation, diffuse, marginalized, experimental. The question is whether we will have the time and inclination to cultivate them before the collapse makes everything even more difficult. And this is a collective responsibility, but also an individual one. Because capitalism, despite its global scale, feeds on the choices we make every day, however conditioned, however limited. Redefining the system inevitably involves redefining what we value, questioning the idea that economic growth is synonymous with success. Be wary of the logic that puts efficiency before empathy, reevaluating the role of work in our lives and what we mean by freedom. No algorithm has imposed these beliefs on us. We have internalized them, often without realizing it. That's why perhaps the first break is not technological or economic, but subjective. We need to decolonize our imagination, recover the ability to dream of different worlds. This does not mean denying the present, but assuming that it is not inevitable. The acceleration that has brought us this far can, with the same force, open up other possibilities. But this requires courage. The courage to imagine the new amidst the rubble of what no longer holds. The courage to ask questions that don't have easy answers. And above all, the courage to start changing from within. While everything around us is still trying to convince us that change is impossible. Cultivating ways of life that are not governed by the logic of profit is perhaps the greatest act of resistance we can practice today. This doesn't mean rejecting technology or denying progress, but reconnecting these elements to more human and collective values. The challenge is not just to think about how capitalism will end, but what we want to put in its place. The most urgent question is not collapse, but construction. What comes next? And are we willing to imagine something new or just wait for the end, like passive passengers in a runaway machine? The philosopher Ernst Bloch said that hope is not an empty waiting, but an active gesture, an exercise of the imagination as a historical force. In this sense, imagining alternatives is not utopia in the pejorative sense of the term, but a political and existential necessity. If we don't build alternatives, we'll just be the residue of the collapse, fragments left by a system that continued without us. But this construction doesn't start from above. It starts here, now, in small everyday practices, in new ways of thinking, in gestures that challenge the automatism of routine. Time, attention, kindness, cooperation. All this has real value, but is systematically devalued by a model that rewards speed and profitability. Rethinking what we value is the first step towards transforming the world around us. And this requires a difficult willingness to abandon the belief that we need a total collapse to start something new. We can start earlier. Change doesn't have to be cataclysmic. It can be gradual, silent, deeply human. It involves slowing down, relearning to be present, building bonds outside the logic of competition. It also involves reimagining what freedom means, not as individualistic isolation, but as shared autonomy, built together. If we want to survive the transition, we will have to rediscover our humanity before it is lost in the impersonal acceleration of machines. The world doesn't have to be exactly the way it is. It is the way it is because it has been shaped by choices, interests, and structures that can be modified. The very history of capitalism is proof of this. It emerged from the destruction of other systems, and, over time, it will also be replaced. The difference is that we are now aware of this. We know about the risks, the symptoms, and the contradictions. The question that remains is, will we do something about it, or wait for history to push us? Nietzsche warned us about the monsters we face and the risk of becoming like them. That's why thinking about post-capitalism isn't just about designing an alternative system. It's about thinking about a new type of subject. A subject that is not defined by consumption, performance, or external validation, but by the ability to reflect, feel, and commit to something greater than oneself. The real revolution begins within, and there is no algorithm that can stop this movement. What seems impossible today can become obvious tomorrow, as long as we are willing to imagine, question, and act. If you've come this far, it's because this content has touched you in some way. And that's exactly why I want to ask you for two simple but very important gestures. Firstly, like this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps to give more people access to reflections like this. And secondly, if this work makes sense to you, please consider leaving a message of support. Your help strengthens this work and allows more content like this to reach more people. Reflection should not be a privilege. It needs to circulate. It needs to reach. It needs to touch. Now tell me honestly, do you believe that capitalism will really end? Or will it just turn into something even more chaotic and difficult to control? Tell me in the comments. I'll read them all. And before you leave, there are 2 videos on the screen right now. In one of them, we delve into an idea that can help us better understand this silent collapse.